you this is their first event with us, my name is Joanna. I'm the project and grant coordinator here with Nevada Housing Coalition, and this is our supportive housing work group. We've been having monthly sessions with the CSH team, our education partners on advancing supportive housing Nevada. And I will keep it short because I know from seeing all your names that I have met many of you and sent you all many emails. So I'll go ahead and introduce Brooke Page, our CSH Director Southwest, so she can get her team introduced and we can talk about our special guest speakers today. Thanks.
Awesome.
Take it away.
Yay. Thank you, Joanna. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again and returning for these really important conversations about supportive housing and how we start and implement and develop supportive housing across the state. Welcome on behalf of CSH. I'm glad to be here and joined today by my colleagues, Chuck Peterson, who you all may have seen in our Elevate Nevada Supportive Housing Incubator Academy. He joins us from Phoenix. And we also have Russell Opitz, who is a new to the Southwest team. Russell is going to be joining us from Utah. He will be our Utah person within the Southwest geography, and we're excited about his expertise and experience working in housing authorities and bringing that housing authority perspective to our work. So thank you so much, Russell. I just want to also just shout out and congratulate all of the projects that may be on today that were selected for the Home Means Nevada initiative for the $500 million that was allocated by the state of Nevada and Governor Sisolak. Congratulations. If you are in the process now of figuring out how to implement that project and really getting the project to pencil, especially as it relates to services funding. If that's an area where you definitely want some guidance and some conversation around services, we would love to have a one-on-one conversation with you. For those folks that are developing supportive housing, now this is the rubber meets the road when we want to implement and make sure we've got the robust service package at the table. I'm going to put my email in the chat. Would love to hear from you directly so we can have a conversation about services and supportive housing. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Russell to get us started today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Joanna and Brooke. I'll just do a quick intro here and introduce our panelists. And as Joanna said, just want to dig into the questions. I'm sure lots of you have questions to ask our panelists. We've got some to ask as well. So we're joined by three panelists today, Nikki Ramirez, Zach Bale, and Sarah Mangrum. And they're joining us today to talk about operating supportive housing projects and really the challenges and successes leveraging partnerships in supportive housing developments, and specifically in the Southwest. So Zach Bale joins us from Salt Lake City, Utah. Sarah Mangrum is from Houston, Texas. And Nikki is located in Phoenix, Arizona. So we've got some surrounding states, panelists, and us. We met last week to kind of go over some prep, and it sounds like many of those states are have experienced what Nevada has maybe 5-10 years ago, right? So maybe what you all are experiencing in Nevada, they have experienced. They've gone through those growing pains within supportive housing, and hopefully there'll be some great lessons learned and things I can share to help you all out. So do some quick just bios of the panels we have here. So Sarah's been working in community development and civic engagement for more than 15 years. Currently, she's at New Hope Housing, supporting the company's growth as a leader and providing housing and services to individuals and families seeking refuge and safety. As New Hope's Housing Director of Residential Programs, Sarah is responsible for social service program design, delivery, and evaluation. Sarah also guides resident service partnerships with New Hope's more than 42 area partners. Sarah received her bachelor's degree from Texas A&M and a master's in public policy from the American University in Cairo, and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa. Zach Bale is an experienced leadership coach and C-suite executive with a track record of leading teams to achieve big results. Zach believes that a focus on people, performance, and growth is key to any successful endeavor. Whether working to align a community behind a common goal or coaching individuals to achieve their best, Zach is at home when inspiring others to perform to their full potential. He currently serves as the Chief Programs Officer with Housing Connect, formerly known as the Housing Authority of the County of Salt Lake. Zach is a licensed clinical social worker with 15 years of experience in human services, fundraising, program evaluation, consultation, and leadership development. He holds a master's in business administration and a master's in social work from the University of Utah. Nikki has 17 years of housing experience in both for-profit and nonprofit housing operations. Nikki is an active realtor and licensed real estate broker in the state of Arizona with 10 years of experience in multifamily property management and affordable housing compliance. Her experience includes managing operations and renovations and affordable housing program compliance across a portfolio of 2,000 units. Nikki is currently the Senior Director of Housing Services for Thrive Services Group. In this role, she oversees program development and coordination and serves as a liaison between real estate development and supportive service teams. Nikki also represents Thrive in their participation within the Arizona Housing Coalition. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background on our three amazing panelists today. With that, we'll just dig into some questions and start with a question to all three panelists to kind of set the stage for the discussion today. And kind of building off what I opened with the history of each region, it would just be great to hear from each of you kind of the history of supportive housing in your region and when each of your communities really began to prioritize the development of supportive housing. And as the topic of this discussion is partnerships, kind of what key partnerships were critical during the infancy and kind of that building up of supportive housing in each of your communities. So I don't know if I can call on someone or if someone wants to jump in. Okay, I'm gonna call on someone. Nikki, do you want to start?
Sure. So a lot to that question, I think, and I was thinking about what that looked like for Arizona. And so I think first I will say my participation in supportive housing started in 2014. So I participated in the CSH Supportive Housing Institute in Phoenix in 2014. And that was when my eyes opened up to this world of supportive housing and paying more attention to homelessness outside of what I was exposed to just within property management. And so that happened to also be the year that critical legislation kind of changed. And I wouldn't even say legislation, it was a ruling on Arnold v. Sarn, and it basically added more resources to our community, specifically for people who are designated with a severe mental illness and experiencing homelessness, and created some pilot housing programs. So it brought a couple of extra entities to the table in regard to supportive housing. And that's actually how I started my first program. It was a pilot program of just 40 clients that we got to house in a permanent supportive housing program who were designated SMI, who were also experiencing chronic homelessness. And so we've seen a lot of momentum shift since then. So from 2014 to now, currently, unsheltered homelessness is at an all-time high. And so it's all over the media in Arizona right now in regard to homelessness and the need for supportive housing and affordable housing and the shortage of housing in general. So it's been interesting to see how it's evolved over time. And then I would also say in the last 2 years, so from about 2019 to 2021, I got to work out in Vegas a little bit and then also out in Houston. And so really learning the kind of what different communities have gone through and at what pace and which stages of the years, and trying to take lessons learned from different communities is where I grew my appreciation for the work that we do regionally. And so I'm just excited to be on this panel today and to hear from the different perspectives and to help apply that to Nevada. Russell, can you help me with what part of that question did I miss?
No, I think that was perfect. And then if you have anything to add, we'll dig into it more later too, but any key partnerships in those early stages that are of note? So key partnerships, I would say our Public Housing Authority is coming to the table with our COC. And so for Maricopa County COC, and then the housing authorities from the individual cities in addition to Maricopa County COC, Housing Authority, and whether it's moving on strategies from permanent supportive housing into
traditional housing choice vouchers when they don't need that wraparound case management, the intensive case management services. They just need the ongoing subsidy. That's been a huge benefit for us to see permanent supportive housing beds be technically freed up, and so that we can continue to extend that resources for people who need the ongoing case management with the subsidy. So that's been a great partnership. Our housing coalition has been a great partner in keeping their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the COCs and the PHAs and bringing all of that together. And so we've been seeing a lot of coordination, I would say, definitely over the last 2 years. And I think that a lot of that came from COVID. All of our communities got flooded with a lot more resources than we had previously. And so really being strategic in how we deployed those funds. If a few good things could come out of that pandemic period, I think the need to coordinate and the desire to coordinate was one of them. And so we were developing that a little bit prior to, and then we saw it pick up even more. So I would say those key entities coming together, and then that helping to reach a wider network of people so that we have more diverse voices at the table when we're making decisions, and so we have less blind spots in that decision-making process.
Great, thanks, Nikki.
And I'm happy to jump in from there, unless you wanted to call on Zach, in which case he can go first. But New Hope, or Houston, and my organization, New Hope, had a sort of similar trajectory. We participated as a collective cohort, and I think it was 2008 when CSH really built out our strategies here in Houston. And so we all sort of came together as social service agencies and housing, which New Hope does, our food banks, our churches, our civic organizations, our housing authorities. I'd really sat down at the table, and through conversations just like this, and with the guidance of CSH and others, we're able to literally sort of break the system that we had before. Everybody was siloed. Everybody was doing their same thing. Everybody was serving homelessness in a way that we understand it as we grow and mature as a system, in ways that don't necessarily help. They can perpetuate. And so we were able to realign a lot of those funds and that energy and that workforce towards a coordinated entry system that really was able to start tackling, first our veteran homelessness, which we effectively solved a few years ago, now to our chronic homelessness, which has dropped close to 70% over the last 12 years since we've really kicked PSH housing into gear here in Houston, and chipping away, of course, at family homelessness and youth homelessness. But the key partners there, and every municipality is different, but Houston has a really strong mayor, and at the time our mayor said this is what we're going to do. They established a sort of a homeless liaison within the mayor's office, a homelessness desk, which I think more and more cities and municipalities across the country are doing, because they've realized this is really an effective tool, an office that can work with the housing authority, work with the Coalition for the Homeless, which is our lead agency here, and the mayor's office, which is strong in Houston, thankfully. Other cities in Texas have different ways. In Austin, for example, they haven't quite had that political will to really drive it home. They're going through a CSH summit, just as you guys are at the moment, to sort of see what they can do to and I can't say a different way, to break the system and to rebuild it in a way that not just encourages social service agencies to come together and focus on housing, but kind of requires it if they want the COC funding and support from the mayor's office, which, if done correctly and well, is not a bad thing. The housing authority here, it's just amazing to me to think that we're sitting around having a conversation about how important it is for the housing authorities to talk to homeless organizations, to the COCs, and creating that linkage, because it's such an intuitive and obvious thing. It's just difficult to get to sometimes because these are huge machines of government infrastructure. And then one other unique sort of entity that came to the table in Houston is our police department. We established really great relationships with our outreach with the Houston the HOT team is called the Homeless Outreach Team. And they've got really cool money to pilot working with our mental health authority to bring along social workers and mental health professionals with them when they go out and take care of calls about homelessness and issues related to that, which has really been able to streamline and build relationships with the homeless on the street who have so far been resistant to going into housing. So that's sort of how it happened. We were lucky enough to have a lot of good political will, which you can't say enough good things about, but organically the sort of boots on the ground social service agencies also came together in a way that guided us in the right direction for sure.
Great, thanks, Sarah. It's a great explanation. Real quick, I should have mentioned, feel free as we go through, we'll save some time at the end. I'm sure there's questions, but as folks are answering questions and we have this discussion, feel free to put stuff in the chat, hop off mute. We can kind of do them as we go as well. Sorry, Zach.
Yeah, no, all good. So Utah timeframe about 2005, 2006 is when things really got started, and a couple of the kind of key things that I think did. So one, really a champion. So Lloyd Pendleton was one of our champions who's since passed, but he was a leader at the state that established the statewide plan, was really a key driver of things. And so I think often that's a pretty important role. Someone needs to play that, or I think when there's great success, there's often that. Proof of concept. So prior to building Congregate PSH, our community, we did a kind of pilot program of scattered site TBRA, cobbling together rental assistance, wanting to serve a bunch of folks who were chronic, even pre-definition of chronic then, and really to show that it worked. I think in our community, there's two narratives that have been really helpful. One, just the part of we want to care for our community. It's the right thing to do. But I think one of the things that's led to the good success is just the business case. That's important probably anywhere, but certainly in Utah and Salt Lake, is to really show that element of there is cost savings or there's impact to be made. And if we don't pick this, there's other alternatives that naturally happen. We serve folks either in the emergency services system, the jail system. And so I think that really helped build a lot of the momentum. Some of the big key things that have happened since the state set up a homeless trust fund where a lot of the funding for services are established. And one of our other champions, it's named after Pamela Atkinson. So that's helped in terms of bridging that gap that I'm sure you all are talking about of you hopefully can get hands-on ways to make rent affordable, but how do you pay for the case management and other supports? The tax credit, influencing the tax credit QAP, the qualified allocation plan to have a PSH set aside carve out. That's something that's existed for the past number of years, and projects now that go in have a better chance of being funded. So that's how most of the PSH has been built in our community. Doing a toolkit. So like you all are together, that was one of the other key elements in the beginning, how we generated a number of hundreds of PSH units in our community fairly quickly in rapid succession. And then we had a dip, which we'll talk about later, but I could also speak to how the momentum gets lost. That's also happened in our community.
Great. Thank you all. And Zach, maybe I'll go to Sarah next for a question, but I think kind of building off of what you mentioned and was mentioned in the last call that we had in this forum around services, right? How do you pay for them? I know there was a conversation last session around, if you're applying and how do you carry debt and kind of show your lenders that in your pro forma that you're going to be able to fund services for the compliance period, right? I think that's a big challenge for folks, right? Like, how do you put that on paper that you're going to have services secured for 15 years or 30 years or whatever it is? So maybe Sarah, from the services perspective, we know it's difficult to pay for and it's really difficult to coordinate. From your experience, what have been the most successful partnerships when navigating service delivery on site? Right.
So the way it works here, for the most part, and there's also, of course, always extenuating special circumstances, but For most of the PSH that we do, it's kind of a three-way partnership between the houser, so the landlord, the developer, the housing authority, which supports through a tenant-based or property-based voucher, and a service provider. So our COC has really come together and is the lead agency for getting the funds, and then supplies those funds to social survey agencies, which will come alongside a service or a houser and support those funds. You know, we are non-expansion state, which Nevada probably is not either. I don't know. I didn't look it up, but we were able at the very beginning to use some 1115 Medicaid waiver funds to kick off the service delivery. We had those for about 7-8 years. We knew that the end was coming, and that's when our COC started looking for additional funds that could help support through Health and Human Services. Again, the mayor's office puts a lot of money towards service provision, things like that. So that's the unique sort of things that happen here. You know, in Dallas, for example, one of the unique things they do is a housing provider will take a Section 8 voucher, and then the delta between what that voucher pays and what the rent is to a normal rent below normal, they use those funds to pay for services. Here at New Hope, we partner intensively, and that's a full-time job to find organizations that have dollars and need units. And that's a way a lot of organizations will just make sure that the really great organizations out there who are doing the great work, but need the people and need the units, know that you know, developers have units available. Sorry, like all Zooms, my cat's coming at me. That always happens. And so what we've done is work with these organizations who have X number of dollars and need X number of units to collaborate intensively using our project-based vouchers to solve chronic homeless. But we always need to shore up those dollars. You know, part of the QAP is always that you need a service provider, boots on the ground to make sure that you're checking all those boxes. And with 10 tax credit developments over the last 10 years, our compliance requirements are quite literally up to about 300 boxes that we have to check every single year. And that's everything from, you know, a weekly exercise class all the way to yearly tax credit and quarterly nutrition education, all those sorts of things. So you need a boots on the ground person that's able to ensure that we're coordinating those and making that happen. You know, you can be creative in who does those. Banks, of course, will always come out and do your financial literacy. Food banks will always come out and do your nutrition education. But you just got to sort of piece those little bits together. But for the clinical case management, shoring it up through local foundations and organizations that can ensure there's no gap between what a service provider can provide and then when they go home at 5 o'clock on a Friday. And then that's when the challenges, of course, as we all know, begin to occur, and making sure we've got someone who's sort of on speed dial for that. It's a puzzle, right? It's always got to be a puzzle, and you've got to look towards the future and be creative enough to see what's coming down the pipeline, and then work with that organization who you can set up for success in getting those dollars.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe, well, Zach, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I think very similar on our side. You know, the homeless trust fund that was established, I think there was some really good kind of leveraging of interest at the state to say, this is a source that we need, that no other source is going to pay. At that time, Medicaid wasn't at all on the radar as a possibility. So across most of our sites, we have a blend of state funds, county funds, fundraised dollars, and then the future that's just beginning is Medicaid expansion. So we're seeing that starting to get established, providers negotiating supportive living rates, and we're hopeful. We've seen in a couple of the ones that we're looking at that it can support a much more expensive services team, and so we're hoping that works. The one downside, if it is a downside, is it's creating projects that are very targeted and who can live there, in terms of to support a team, you know, a team with X amount of billable rate, the project needs to serve this population and it's a subset. So I think that's one of the areas where I've been hesitant to say we're totally celebrating, but it will help. More money's coming into the system as a result.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Zach. And I'll ask you a follow-up question to that in a minute. But to Sarah, your points, and Zach or whoever wants to chime in on this, I think the last discussion this group has had, maybe some, like whatever you're comfortable with as an organization, and that varies greatly, I think, by organization. But what are you comfortable with securing in the way of services? Like 3 years of services secured for a project, 4 years. You know, how do you plan and budget for something that is an unknown, for something like a single site PSH project, right? Or do you have that, or kind of how? I know there's a lot of gray there.
You mean from a developer side or a service provider side?
I think more from like the risk side, right? Like how do you show, like what are you comfortable putting forth, right? So you're saying that you're going to have supportive services at a property, say for 15 years, but you know in your position that you only have guaranteed funding for the next 2 years. Like, are you comfortable with that? And then kind of what's your strategy? And you went over your strategy of like how you get that ongoing, but I think maybe like the question is like, what are you comfortable with if there's a number? I think at least that's what I heard last session is like, how do you know that, you know, services are going to be secured? And I think a lot of people struggle with that of, I only have 1 year of service funding. Like, can I really put a project forward?
And that's a really hard decision to make. You're right, because the nature of the population that we're serving with these service dollars, if you're going to talk about PSH, the P means something, right? And if we're going to serve chronic homeless, they're not going to be stable and working $15 an hour by January of 2024, right? That's just the nature. Yeah. We know that this is long-term commitment. You know, I think, again, you have to, and I know this is not like good business advice, but you have to have a crystal ball and you have to have proof of concept. Like Zach said, you've got to do really good work and reiterate those grants over time. You know, you've got to check your boxes on the compliance so you don't get in trouble there, and that can kind of push you forward. For a developer like New Hope, from a perspective of that, you've always got to have something in the works so that your developer fees come through year over year, right? So we know we're going to have developer fees on 2 projects next year and hopefully 2 projects the year after that. And you can pass through the funding in that way. Partnering with an organization that comes to you and says, I need units for chronic homeless and I've got 3 years of funding, again, is a really challenging, it's a hard ask. And we have had to change partners. I think that's another point here, is that when you do run out of funding for X partner, or they come to you and say, we don't have any more money, we can't pay our staff, you know of an organization that can shore that up and fill in. And you also have to have, you know, at least a few staff of your own who can go in and fill in. You know, and there's a difference between the rental subsidy and the services subsidy. You know, if the rental subsidy can be through a housing authority or voucher or that kind of stuff, and a lot more long-term, you can be a lot more comfortable with that. I don't know, to answer your question really clearly, I don't know that we would do 3 years on a rental subsidy. That would have to be a permanent subsidy. We could do 3 years, be comfortable with 3 years of funding for services. But if the funding for the unit, if the rent runs out, that person has to move if there's zero income. If they don't have services dollars, we can shore it up and make it happen.
Great, thanks. And I think maybe the lesson that I've heard, you know, having someone dedicated to that position, right? Not just getting a project off the ground and saying like, okay, it's going to be like this for the next 15 years. Like having someone, there's going to be times you're going to have to pivot. You're going to have to change partners, change models, constantly working on it. So thank you for that. Maybe next to Zach, talking about kind of the perspective of housing authorities. Really wondering like what resources or partnerships, you mentioned a few projects during your last statement, but yeah, what are the key partnerships when you're trying to, you know, you have the subsidy as a housing authority, and how do you choose what projects to fund, and how do partnerships play into that, and what makes those strong and successful?
Yeah, that sounds great. maybe one kind of history piece. I was thinking about, how are we at the table as a public housing authority? And I think there's a benefit in that our leadership. So Janice, who's currently our CEO, worked on the homelessness side, worked at the shelter, experienced and interacted with a lot of families experiencing homelessness. And that really brought the drive of the agency. So there's this fortuitous, the leader cares, or maybe cares in this specific way about housing for folks who are experiencing homelessness. So I think that's a pretty critical element. So now thinking about it here, let's say, PHA in general, do they have interest? Do they not? Well, if they do, I think the thing to think about is what's their strategic plan of how they're going to use them? Are they at a point where they're interested in project basing more of their vouchers? I think often we talk about it, they're kind of like gold. They're like gold to the developer, but I think even the housing authority kind of holds and monitors their cap of how much they have available. So I think it's important to understand what their general plan is. Us as an example, we're converting a lot of our public housing, and one of the reasons we're kind of holding at the moment is we're not sure how much of that we'll need for our own internal kind of projects. And then once we have clear eyes on that, then we'll continue to put RFPs back out into the community. The partnerships are critical. So the way that we've done it might be different for others is we want skin in the game. We'd want ownership in a project. We know that they're a limited benefit. We also want kind of the hard design or the teeth around if we're going to put subsidy into a project, we want to make sure that it's used for what the intent was. So we see that structure as kind of the way to ensure that we have some clout down the road in case something goes south. The thing that's great that I think maybe seeking the alignment with the PHA is, do they share the same philosophy about what impact they want to make? And one of the hard decisions that we have is we either use it for this or use it for that. And so we know that if we're going to project base, let's say 50 vouchers, there's households on our Section 8 wait list that won't be served, or it'll take longer to go through our wait list. And so knowing that there's often those trade-offs I think is important to keep in mind. Just think if there were any others. I think having that connection with your housing authority, I think getting close and sometimes it doesn't have too much detail, but our HUD 5-year plan, look at that. There's probably some clues in there to know whether there's alignment and interest. And then certainly the connection with the leadership, I think, is critical to make sure that they understand why and why it's important.
Great, thanks, Zach. And not to get too far on the weeds with PHA mechanics, but you mentioned you have a resource and you can either use it for housing choice vouchers or project-based or however you use that resource. And you mentioned Janice, the CEO, being aligned more towards homeless services and homeless housing. And so aside from that, are there advantages to housing authorities, and what are those to work with supportive housing?
Yeah, that's great. So the quick one that comes to mind, maybe a question you could ask is, we see right now a lot of folks that get issued a voucher. It's a tough rental market. It's hard to find places to rent. And so maybe one of the easy selling points is the nice thing of project base is it's tied to a unit that exists for a specific purpose. So in terms of getting folks into housing, that can be a great angle. So that's probably number one for us, is in particular for the population that already have many barriers to get into housing. Finding a unit can be a really tough one. So I think that one for sure. I think maybe the second is just community clout. So each housing authority is a little different, but if one looks at us as saying, this is a community resource that should be available to all, and we're looking at equity, there's probably a case to be made to say, this should be open. And so maybe looking at numbers and who's currently being served. And I would imagine for some housing authorities, it's only a slice of the population of who need it most. And so there could be some work to do there around, what's the full need in the community, who's most vulnerable and needs it, and does that align with who they're currently supporting in their voucher program? So that might be another angle. It could feel a little adversarial, but it also, at times, that maybe is the way to go about it.
Great, thanks. All right, Nikki, we'll go to you next. And you kind of mentioned some of this in the opening question, but just kind of your experience with CSH and kind of how that shifted your mindset around supportive housing and working within supportive housing. And I guess from the property management perspective, I think have quite a few property managers on today's session. So just want to hear from you and your experience. And you've held various roles and are now more on the services, but as your bio stated, right, you have lots of experience on the real estate side and property management side. So thinking about partnerships, what have been the most successful partnerships when trying to navigate that very challenging role of managing, both like the financial asset, the physical asset, while having these low barrier supportive housing projects? How do you manage both of those? And from your experience in supportive housing, who are like the key partners that need to be in that equation to make it successful?
Well, that is a great and complex question. And I'm thinking of all the different phases that we've gone through over the years. So yes, I started out in property management. Traditionally, I started as a leasing agent, promoted to an assistant, promoted to a property manager, was a regional at our compliance department. And the portfolios, I used to be the one evicting, and it's easy to evict people in the state of Arizona. I've gone to court 2 times out of hundreds of evictions that I processed because we know we're going to win. And that's just how it is on the property management side. So we're in Arizona's a very landlord friendly state. Going through the Supportive Housing Institute, understanding many kind of light bulbs went off in that time. Understanding motivational interviewing and stages of change was incredible for me because it helped me to understand how I was engaging with people and how I was shifting my residents' behavior without even knowing it, just by how I was engaging in conversation and how I was framing a question. So there were things that came out of the Supportive Housing Institute that helped me to be better at my job just in property management alone. But I had this paradigm shift of truly understanding housing instability and the spectrum that it exists within and what that can look like at different phases. And all of the things that can contribute to a family experiencing housing instability or an individual experiencing it that have nothing to do with actual housing. And so when you look at all of those different factors, it really made me realize that I needed to understand all of these different industries. So whether it's clinical case management, whether it was the nonprofit service providers, and then looking at property management and asset management differently. So it's a very unique situation when you have a resident who's also a client and they're exhibiting behaviors that are violating the lease. And that behavior, if it's disrupting the peaceful enjoyment of the property for all of the other residents, then it's as a property manager, you're trying to balance respecting the rights of all of your residents and not trying to evict this one individual. At the same time, if this one individual's behavior is going to result in you receiving 10 notice to vacates over the next 30 days or people wanting out of their leases, then that's kind of one of the first thoughts that come to a property manager's mind is they're trained to be the best in their job, to do what they need to do to make sure that is a well-performing asset, that their occupancy is high, that their rents are in line with their submarket, that they're not violating fair housing, that there's all of these things that go into property management and asset management that come first. And then there's all of the complexity of all these human lives and these human beings living on your property that can make that easier or can make that harder. And so it's this really interesting balance. But I think one of the aha moments for me was realizing that when you're working with a supportive housing program, the individual that you're renting to comes with a support network. And so when you have that support network in place, there's a little bit less risk than just working with any other resident who doesn't have a known support network. You're blind in renting to them and not knowing, well, if something does occur, what are you going to do? And so I looked at it as almost a strength. And it's a strength when you're working with a well-known provider who's a great partner, who's responsive, who shows up when you're having a non-compliance issue, who keeps you in the loop, who, you know, is really side by side with you in that. I've had other experiences where that wasn't the case. And that's always disappointing because there's enough non-believers in supportive housing in the world that I don't ever want to create more of them. Like, I just want to make sure that we're all doing the best that we can do so that, you know, it's easy to believe that supportive housing works because we know it does. And so it's been interesting. I think that I had to learn their language. Like, everybody can speaking English in the room at the moment, but we can be speaking completely different languages in the lingo of property management language is totally different than clinical language. And so having to understand what somebody is saying when they're speaking and to understand how to respond to that, it took a while to learn those languages, and not just for myself, but for others in the room, so that I can see when something was being misinterpreted or when it wasn't being received at all. And so communication can be one of the biggest barriers to those relationships. And I would also just say that those relationships took time. It's not a one and done. You don't get it right the first time. You won't get it right in the first year. Like, there's going to be those kind of, you know, speed bumps, and you can get off track for a little bit, but you have to have this commitment to keep trying with each other and to communicate the best that you can and come back to the table and then work through it, and then understand the why behind the what. Understand why they're approaching it the way that they're approaching it, or why they feel they have to, and being really curious and asking, is there any other way it can be done? Can we have more time to do this? Could it take a different process? Can we add another step? Like, it's just thinking about your positions in different ways than you would traditionally think about them. And then as far as partnerships go, I honestly made friends with every clinical case manager I could think of, every nonprofit service provider that I can think of, and at all different levels, just to understand what their job looked like, how they do what they do. Everybody, in my opinion, wants to be good at their jobs. Like, you want to enjoy what you do, and being good at it helps you enjoy it more. And so, just finding the common ground between like why we do what we do and how we do it, and how we can come together and make it easier for each other. I learned that the referrals can work two ways. So if they were bringing me clients and I'm housing their clients, if I'm to pick up the phone and call one of them and say, hey, I have a resident who's not your client, who's not anybody's client, and it appears they're having their like very first mental health episode, and like police were engaged by other residents and that didn't go anywhere, but I want to get on top of this, and it really seems like this person needs help, or this person's telling me as a property manager they want help, but I'm a property manager. Like, at that time, I wasn't trained in case management. I wasn't trained in other things. And so it was like, where do I go? What do I do? And they were very willing to guide me, to help me, and tell me where to send referrals and how to help someone. And so when you build those relationships and it becomes a two-way street where you're sending referrals both ways and you're helping people at the, from different angles at the same time, that becomes just a mutually beneficial relationship that I found to be very fruitful in multiple ways over the years.
Great. I love that, Nikki. I love that last example of just creating that network, right? The network of colleagues across services and property management. I think it's no secret that many on the call today, whether you're in property management, development, services, you're probably overworked, you have a large caseload, or you have a large portfolio to manage, and the extra help is great. And I think it takes time to build those relationships and to build that network, and time that you don't have. But I think your example of just doing the work to get those relationships established, I think, your last example is what everyone hopes, right? Like, you're in a property management position and you have clients, experiencing things that they don't even have a case manager for, that you can call upon these service providers to help you. And I would guess that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm guessing that over time, that made your job easier, having supportive housing in your portfolio. Because I think it's no secret that folks, you don't need to be on a supportive housing voucher to be someone who experiences many of the same things that those on a supportive housing voucher have, right? Housing instability or crisis or, all of those things. So
Absolutely.
I just want to reiterate what you just said. I think that's so critically important. Everybody has challenges. If you're a landlord, you will have challenging residents who need services. The difference that we're talking about is you have somebody you can call who knows how to address those issues and prevent eviction and stabilize the housing, which is the bottom line for the property manager, right? That's what they need and want. And that's the key difference here. Everybody has challenges. These folks have services attached to them.
So just a plug, if you're working on a project and need help with services, please make sure you reach out to us, because obviously this is a critical component to supportive housing. So thank you so much for this. Great.
Well, we've got maybe 10 minutes. I want to get to some questions that people have. Otherwise, we have lots more questions, but looks like there's one in the chat. Panelists mentioned having a large number of check boxes that need to be met. Can some of those requirements be shared so that those of us who are just beginning the process can have those guidelines to use while developing projects? One other issue is how others have successfully addressed the NIMBYism.
So to answer the question about,
check boxes,
to answer that question, and Zach alluded to the QAP. So all of these requirements come from developing with tax credits and the services required there. Because of clever organizations who can influence those things, most of the boxes you need to check are what case management is, right? So it is kind of, you can put them into 3 buckets, right? So it's the community engagement, the community building, which is critical. The social engagement, we do movie nights and birthday parties and all that kind of stuff that's meant to bring folks together who are historically disenfranchised and isolated. That helps create calm and community. Priceless. And then it's other things like financial literacy classes. So everybody needs budgeting, right? And it can be budgeting on, how do we pay our rent with our small amount of money and then, purchase food and all the other necessities. It's things like nutrition education, cooking classes, which case managers can certainly should be doing anyways. Counseling, AAs, and mental health support groups that case managers and counseling should be doing anyways. So absolutely, you can leverage. You don't have to do it all yourself. You have to find the right people doing the right thing, and then together just check that box. Again, once you get to the place where you've got many, many, many boxes to check, you do need oversight on that, because it's a big deal if you forget to check the box or you're canceled for a rainy day, right? Like the IRS doesn't care if it rained on bingo day. You got to have bingo. So yes, leverage and coordinate and collaborate to get those done, because they are so important to stability in PSH housing.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. We're kind of running out of time. Hopefully Zach's going to jump in on NIMBYism and maybe related to partnerships, maybe law enforcement or something else. But
yeah, sure, NIMBY. So the first thought that comes to mind is just push like hell. I don't know if there's a secret to it. I think sadly often the first projects are just not in the greatest locations because that's the only place they can go per the community pushback, but they shouldn't be. Russell mentioned it, the partnership with law enforcement. I think a couple of our first projects in Salt Lake County, Salt Lake City, we had tons of support from those entities that know we're already dealing with them. They're at our light rail track stops. They're already in your neighborhood, on your lawn. We're picking them up. If we had housing to drop them off at back home, that's way better than the current alternative. So I think having those main entities, which then also aligned the political leadership, making sure that there's adequate, community council, city council, political representative support. You're not going to get everybody, but you need the count. You need enough. So where the votes are going to fall a certain direction, that's kind of the area of the push like hell. And then I think most of the projects have really proven the concern wrong, so that after they get established, for the most part, the concerns dissolve. Property values don't go down as everyone feels they will. The headaches in the local neighborhood probably improve more often than get worse, at least with housing. Shelter is a different conversation, but that's not for today.
If I can just add to that, I completely agree with everything that Zach said. When it comes to NIMBYism, Arizona just went through something really unique. There was a bill that didn't get passed in the last legislative session, but what it did create is a housing supply study committee. And so we have spent the last several months doing listening sessions for what is scheduled for 2 hours, but often turns into 4 hours of hearing from experts on why it's difficult to develop housing. And we're talking any kind of housing. We've heard from like for-profit single-family home developers to, market rate multifamily developers, and then also affordable housing developers and supportive housing developers. So we're seeing difficulty in developing housing across the spectrum in the middle of a housing crisis. And so we were really exploring where those barriers come from. Some of it is from zoning, a lot of it's from NIMBYism. And a couple of things that have really been highlighted over the last year is, yes, you're right, Zach, on the notes of like the existing projects once they're built, they improve communities. And once people can see it, once they can tour it and they know what it looks like and feels like and how it enhances their community in comparison to what was there beforehand, that's always a great proving point. Sometimes they don't even realize that the property they're passing by is an affordable housing community or a supportive housing community, and that it does great things. But what we're hearing from a lot of NIMBYism individuals is that they're concerned about traffic, when they don't realize that apartment communities and or just rental communities, they produce less traffic than retail or office spaces actually do. So if you're concerned about traffic, you should be concerned about different types of uses going into that space rather than a multifamily housing use going into that space. In Arizona, we're having water issues right now. So there's concern about water usage. And it's like, well, agriculture uses 75% more water than a housing community would. So I think information in those key facts has proven to be really useful and changed a lot of minds of people. You're still going to have people out there who will just stand by that NIMBYism position, but I've seen a lot of improvement in being able to change minds just with information and the data to dispel the myths that are out there with really good facts, and then allowing them to see it is kind of what's the game changer. It's the cherry on top that proves out that they are really well-run, nice communities that are adding to the greater community's value.
Great, thank you all. Well, we're unfortunately out of time. I feel like we could talk for a few more hours, which is always a great way to end, I think. So yeah, just maybe one last, just big thanks to panelists, Sarah, Zach, Nikki. Yeah, it was just really great to hear all of your experiences from the different states. And I think there's going to be a lot of things that can be applied to Nevada. So thank you all. And Joanna or Brooke, I don't know if you have any closing remarks. There was one comment about housing versus shelter as a future topic.
I wrote that down.
Okay. And then, yeah. And then as Brooks, if there's other lingering questions, as Brooke mentioned, around or wanting to learn more about services, I think that invitation's open. So
yes, please email us. Thank you so much, Russell, for putting on a phenomenal panel, and to our panelists representing Texas, Arizona, and Utah, all in one call for Nevada. This is super important perspective, and we just can't thank you enough for taking the time out to be here and helping us really understand and operationalize why this intervention is proven, evidence-based, and that it works, and people are getting housed and staying housed for the long haul. So thank you so much. I'll pass it to Joanna.
Yes, thank you so much. Wow, that was like very amazing. And I want to keep talking. I'm like, oh, it turns out we could actually have this conversation many times, and hopefully we will. So please stay tuned. We're working on programming for year 2 of Elevate Nevada in partnership with CSH to keep these conversations going. And in the last minute, I just want to say, like, what an amazing job the CSH Southwest team has done. Crushed it once again, clearly crushing it all across the region. Have these amazing folks working together And I'm really, really inspired by this conversation. And I really hope those of you who are new, please reach out to me if you're interested in talking more, or I can send you links to some of the previous stuff that we've done or the recordings on our YouTube channel. And please register for our upcoming events at our website, nvhousingcoalition.org/events. So we're having some affordable housing development trainings coming up. And then sign up for the newsletter so you can be the first to know when we start 2023 programming in partnership with CSH. Awesome. You guys are really amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody who joined us today. And I can't wait to talk to you again very soon.
Thank you.